And I mean, I certainly take the point that neoliberal policies have weakened the bargaining power of workers. But there is a factor that has not been mentioned so far, and that is automation, which is certainly going to affect labor markets in a number of areas. Perhaps not in the caring professions that much, but certainly in others. So what if you lose your job not to a lower wage jurisdiction, but to a robot? So I just to be interested in any comments about how the effects of automation are going to affect labor markets. Thanks.
Sausan Rifai, University of Ottawa. I want to thank you so much for this very interesting presentation, and I do have actually a question with respect to the role actually of businesses, because of course we are saying financial elites are causing, of course, all these problems. But then here, are we doing enough to audit their practices when it comes to, gender equality measurements and also these particular working conditions? Because without them being on the table and without us asking them to provide an account of how they fire and hire these people, I think that we will always be here just debating on like these issues of inequality. But at the end of the day, we are requiring them to pay taxes. But why don't we ask them also to give us an account on how do they fire and end up contributing to this situation of where people are losing their jobs, under those threats, etc. I know it's problematic because of the scale and also because of so many businesses, but I think if it becomes something of a legislative nature, I think we should be able to, reach some solutions, because I've seen people being fired even here in Canada for reasons that are not always viable, and they end up becoming really living in precarious conditions. Thank you.
Actually, I would disagree with the point that automation won't affect the caring industries. I think automation will have a profound effect on the caring. I would say it's actually currently having a profound effect on the organization of work. That's not my area, but certainly I was out at a conference not too long ago and saw a McKinsey report, of all things, looking at the impact on automation on it, like 10 years, a decade out, and what in terms of employment levels and where it shifts in occupation. And they forecast, certainly there would be, in terms of job destruction and the new creation, that it would have a significant impact on gendered workers, equally on men as women. And I think what we'll see over time is not obviously the destruction of work, but the reemergence of new types of work. My concern, I should have actually brought some of that information. My concern in this situation is, we've seen over the last 20 years, when you might have expected better and more significant economic gains that women have made, and really, you see I didn't have this graph, but you see up to the mid-90s and the plateauing on many indicators for women's economic security. In part because obviously time doesn't stand still, capitalism doesn't stand still, the labor market has accommodated, and old disparities then become reinterpreted in new ways. Looking forward, automation, the question then becomes, will this, set the tech, Silicon Valley would have us believe that this will be, I don't think the advance of the leisure society, but will occasion greater prosperity. My concern, of course, is that it will entrench the gender division of labor in new ways. I don't see, and again, it's just my area, the specifics of how that will work through caring industries per se, but given that women are disproportionately in the temporary precarious, they populate those sectors. That's particularly true for Indigenous and racialized women. What is the liberatory impulse of automation? I've not been convinced by that at this juncture, so it will have a significant impact going forward.
I mean, as you probably know, that was a pretty bare bones presentation of what all might be contributing to wage stagnation. So, I mean, but I think it's friendly to adding all kinds of other considerations which are relevant. For sure, technological change happens over, the decades that we're talking about, and that has all kinds of impacts that differentially affect certain workers in different ways. We could be talking about all kinds of policy environment questions like, is there a foreign temporary workers program, and which kind of workers? And so, there are many ways in which certain subgroups get advantaged or disadvantaged, as well as just, the overall unemployment rate and various things. So, Okay, so what you're commenting on is quite profound, because, I mean, that is off the neoliberal playbook, right? That we would have as a society some sorts of objectives that we felt superseded the capacity of businesses to run however way they see fit. Right? That, like, to do what you're saying means embracing the idea that there is some sort of democratic institutions which are empowered to do, you know, the kinds of things that you're speaking of. Like, I'm all for it, but it is not, up until now, the cultural assumption that has been cultivated by neoliberalism. We would have to have, like, in a way, the environmentalists are kind of poking us, nudging us in this direction, right? Because there is something greater than running your business in the way you see fit that matters and should perhaps trump, we should perhaps, you know, whatever. Yes, it should overrule that.
I've got a bit of a more cynical answer to that. You know, social license to operate is obviously an important, and we've seen that certainly in the environmental sector, corporate social responsibility. In fact, most of our major multinational capital are actually quite astute at corporate responsibility and have a whole departments dedicated to it. And actually, in many ways, I don't want to take one brush to saying that none of those are important initiatives, and they have been important. They've obviously the relative merit of that. I guess I'm a bit of a nuts and bolts kind of girl. Like I think employment standards, the new pay transparency legislation that the Liberals are supposed to be working on that we haven't seen yet, may never see. I mean, these types of measures, I think, are ultimately where we have to go in terms of laying the foundation. Certainly the reforms that the Ontario government brought in that were rolled back by Ford, those were really important things because they raised the minimum wage laws. I think those are critical to focus on and mobilize behind. I think the pay transparency will be fascinating because, of course, it seems to be revealing, it's the other piece of what pay equity legislation, which I don't have an enormous amount of, well, it's going to be decades. Anyway, that's another discussion. But that kind of level of transparency and accountability are tools that can be used to propel business to behave in more equitable and transparent ways. In terms of climate culture, it's fascinating, and this is a longer discussion, certainly in business schools, like there's the gender shop at U of T, the Rotman School, Sarah Kaplan's work. It's kind of interesting. Talking about, you know, women are getting into businesses in greater numbers and the like. So the question used to be, how can we encourage and diversify? I was talking about that in terms of desegregate occupations. They're getting into and they're not staying. And why is that? And again, it's all together, but culture, structure, toxicity, all of that sort of thing. So there's a discussion to be had, but I think it's really about our institutional foundations, and that's where I would place our energy.
Hello, my name is Akash Maharaj. Thank you for your presentation. I have, I guess, two questions, mainly about your observation about wage stagnation. As I looked around the room and as you described stagnating wages and the tragedies of that, I saw a lot of people's heads nodding in agreement. But I have to say, yesterday, when we heard people talking about the illusion of constant growth and the fact that that is not sustainable, especially without destroying the environment in which we live, I saw many of those same heads nodding. Since growing wages, I would think, growing real wages would imply, with the long term, growing production and growing consumption. Is it sustainable to hope for indefinite growing wages, or is there a natural limit, or a point at which, especially in wealthy countries, we have to think about real wage stability and real wage resilience? The second question I had is over why the public policy options which voters have been voting in have been the very policies that seem to be, as you've described, seem to be causing wages to stagnate. Do you think that voters have been rewarding those policies by electing such governments because progressive voices have not been effective in coming up with alternatives, or that progressive voices have not been effective in making the case to the electorates?
My name is Bessa Whitmore, and I have a question. To what extent is the critique of neoliberalism reaching those who are actually able to make a difference. So World Trade Organization, the financial sector, multinational corporations and governments, they're increasingly talking about the alarm around debt levels, individual family debt levels, and the coming crash. So I wonder, at what point are we at a tipping point of moving away from the neoliberal project?
So the point that I'm going to start addressing is that, Ellen, you want wages to grow, aren't you complicit in this endless growth and its environmental consequences? My summary. In my view, we are, I don't have words for this, we seem to be unable to consider issues of distribution. Like if, as some of the other speakers have pointed out, how skewed have been the benefits of growth thus far. It seems to me we could do quite a lot with redistributing what we've got, but because that's almost always off the table, then we're forced into this narrower debate, which is like, well, if you want things to be better for working people, you actually hate the environment, right? It's a tough spot to be placed in. So to try and get out of that box, to me, questioning distribution is pretty important. I would secondly say that if you were to change the way resources are distributed in ways that really enhanced public services meaningfully, then my preoccupation about rising wages would be affected. Like it's not that my end game here is that people have just a pocket full of money. It's that they have good lives. And if they can get good lives by socially providing things that have been privatized at this point, then I'm delighted. Oh, somebody was, why voters are voting for policies that seem to cause wages to stagnate? That's fascinating, I think we don't understand this well enough, but here's some, trial balloons. I think if you have been scared for a really long time and you have very little hope, what can make sense is a little trinket. Like in the sense of, a tax cut that's going to give me 50 more bucks. My life may be a mess in 57 different ways. I cannot afford, like the lifestyle I want. Things are getting harder every year. And somehow that tax cut is sold to me like as being what I should be fixated on. And, it can work if there's not really any other vision out there. I mean, this is part of, it's been very difficult for us to sustain a vision that connects to people. I mean, I'm sure there are forces out there who want our vision to look unrealistic and, you've probably all heard the comments that are thrown our way that way. Is there something else for me?
Can I just add to this question about why we elect parties that introduce the policies that are clearly not dealing with these problems? What really strikes me about, for example, the current election campaign is that there's almost no discussion about the things that really matter in terms of how the market itself distributes the benefits of economic activity. There is talk about taxes, there is, to a lesser extent, talk about transfers, but why the market economy is generating such unequal outcomes in terms of income from earnings is not really under discussion. And when we think about potential reforms to lead to a more desirable distribution of income, I mean, there's various envelopes of policies we might think about. How is the labor market regulated? To what extent is there a favorable environment for workers to have empowerment? Retraining and other human capital related issues, or even on the international front, labor standards. You don't see these things being discussed, so when we go to the polls, we don't have any clear idea about how the different parties think about that, and I mean, frankly speaking, I don't think they're thinking a lot about it in the first place.
I'll pick up on that discussion, the current election. It's extraordinary that the dominant theme, everybody, it's not. All right. It's extraordinary. The dominant theme, of course, is one that progressives might rally behind around affordability. And of course, it was the Conservative Party that took up this mantle, which could have been out of the playbook of the NDP 10 years previous around affordability, and trying to create a discursive space where people could link those issues and attach policy proposals to them. Yet the proposals on offer, their major one was a tax cut, obviously, to the middle class, or rejigging of the lowest income bracket, a tax credit, which the Liberals then one-upped. No one's speaking about actually what taking $6 billion out of the general revenues would ultimately mean, which was the question, obviously, that John and Bob were talking about. Whether it's the failure of the progressive left to create a narrative that people can mobilize behind, the failure of, policy visionaries, I struggle with that, and I think there's lots of people in the room who would have lots of things to say about that, are more skilled than I. Sitting at a think tank where part of our mandate is to engage in progressive alternatives and put that into the policy mix of the country. I think we do a pretty good job, CCPA, by and large, but I would also say it's kind of a bit lonely in the wilderness that Canada doesn't have a long history, culture of public academics or, progressive, the debate, even of the kind you see in Europe typically. I remember doing my doctoral work in Sweden and being gobsmacked at all of the academics that were putting op-eds in local newspapers and actually discussing very substantive policy, and that hasn't been true in Canada. The other thing I'd say about that is, being in research and like the issue of communication is always very top of mind at everything we do. Like, what products are we developing? How do we get that out there? How important it is to be in the media? Like, what is that about? Is that I was really struck by a study, and you've probably seen it, an American scholar, his last name's Rich, can't remember where he's teaching. He did a piece 10 years ago where he said, there's no mistake that the big think tanks in the States, Brookings and the like, started upwards of 100 years ago in the Enlightenment tradition, spend 80% of their budgets on research and 20% on communications, whereas the more neoconservative ones that emerged much later actually spend 80% of their budgets on communications and 20% on research, because they actually don't care what the research says, because they have an ideological agenda. And lo and behold, it's not unimportant that in a period we were talking about in the 1980s, when Reagan and Thatcher took command of the global agenda, you did have extraordinary resources of those types of institutions influencing, in this case, policymakers and the like. So we ignore communication at our peril. I'm not sure. This is an observation. I don't have a prognosis. As I said, there are people in this room that are much more skilled at communications and comms than I am, and campaigning. We're trying to change that agenda. Certainly that's the intent of the Broadbent Institutes, trying have their shoulder to the wheel. But it's important to put those discussions out there and to engage, because I think people can mobilize behind a progressive alternative vision, whether that's the New Deal, the variant here in Canada. Hard to say, can't we take I'll take solace from 500,000 people in the street in Montreal, would that it had happened elsewhere. But I do have some hope that we can move this forward.
Thank you very much for these excellent presentations. And as a ecofeminist who believes that corporate social responsibility is an oxymoron, and it's certainly a contradiction in terms, and I have been always concerned about the messaging, the amount of money that goes into the so-called wrong messaging, how we can get some of the other messaging out. I'm old enough to remember corporate welfare bums, and a few other slogans like that. And that's one of the things that worries me, is that what we're talking about is complex. I love the iceberg analogy, but we're talking about complex things that relate to each other. It makes it harder to express it. One thing I'd like to ask is there any body of work somewhere in academe that discusses the economic impact of the disadvantage impact of neoliberalism. For example, health costs among women who are trying to balance home, job, and volunteer work or advocacy, higher rates of fibromyalgia, higher rates of depression, the crime rate increase, the cost of providing health care to people on the street, terrorism, all those kind of things that are part of a disintegrating society. We're clear on, right now, on the disintegrating environment or ecosystem, not mentioned enough, but not understood well, but we also have a disintegrating society as well, as you can really see in the United States. So I'm interested if there's any of that available.
Well, as a large L Canadian liberal, I take issue with the neoliberalism. And I think American small L liberals might take issue with it as well. It doesn't quite describe what these policies are. I just wanted to try and link income distribution, which is the main thing, with the housing crisis, because while there are both supply and demand factors, it has been argued that the lack of housing is really more of an income problem than a supply problem. And if you think that only 235,000 are homeless, the proportion of these not being able to perhaps live in a permanent residence, that it becomes more evident. As a small landlord and also a member of ACORN, which is a housing advocacy society, I rent to people on social welfare or disability, and you get assured payment, maybe at a lower level, but the low levels of provincially determined welfare and disability are really a constraint on housing, or puts these housing costs over the 50% level. So even raising income levels of these types of people on welfare, would go a long way to solving a lot of the housing crisis, which is as much or more an income problem than a really a supply problem.
I can quickly, I think the whole discussion about what's driving the income versus supply, I think there's a strong argument to be made that we have a real lack of affordable housing, rental in particular in Canada, and that's been a real constraint, and partly because the government, as Leilani so eloquently said, abandoned housing in the 90s and purpose-built rental. Setting that, I want to speak a bit about, yes, there is a literature that talks about the costs of neoliberalism and tries to quantify it. It's an interesting discussion. Certainly, you know, whether the cost of incarcerating people, you quantify that, the cost to social assistance, the cost of high levels of stress, chronic illness, the WHO, social determinants of health, there are certainly numbers. Yes, I think they're persuasive. I say that coming from an organization that peddles in quantitative data and research. My hesitation has always ever been that at the end of the day, this is an issue of ethics, and it's important not to abandon that, because we can produce great numbers till the cows come home, but will that move? And I think it's important to understand narrative, impact, communications, and that goes back to my earlier point. Yeah, the scale of the impact of neoliberalism is extraordinary. Leilani was most eloquent in spelling that out. But we haven't been able to move people with that narrative. So I think it really is this work in progress that we have to keep our shoulders to the wheel to think about how to actually affect change in the work that we do, and how we leverage that to make a difference. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, so this is just me being me, I guess, but I go to a lot of places where people say, in a sense, we've lost. How come more people don't understand these problems? You get the idea, right? That how could we have worked for so long to have so little to show for it? And I would like to reframe that those who don't want the public to see the issues that we're talking about, they work constantly to make it very difficult to understand, how these issues get perpetuated. I mean, it is a constant drumbeat out there of not great information or just confused information that makes it very difficult for someone who isn't really quite dedicated to grasp the issues that we're talking about in this room. So in a way, we're doing okay, given that they are a very well-financed megaphone that drowns us out a whole lot. And, one of the nice things about teaching like students who are 18, 20, 22 is that they haven't been completely indoctrinated in this. And I can see occasionally that, they think this is all quite plausible what I'm saying. So, I just take heart in the sense that it does matter that we are out there not vacating the field for only that version of reality to become the only version possible of reality.
Okay, thank you both. Well, I hope you join me in thanking our speakers.